By the early 14th century, the empire in the east had become greatly circumscribed. Much of the previous century had been occupied by crusading armies of Latinate, Trinitarian Christians, marching through Constantinople, attacking the heretical Christianity, as they saw it, of the Greek citizens of Constantinople. The Saracens had nibbled away at various parts of the empire, and although the Greeks at last wrested control of Constantinople from the French and Venetians, civil war and internal strife was to doom the Byzantine throne. By 1320, a new dynasty was enjoying the purple of Byzantium, the Paleologi family, with the first of that name, Andronicus, reigning 50 years, with his son Michael, who was crowned in May 1295 and who died in October 1320, the second emperor in that lineage. Michael's son was also named Andronicus, but he quarrelled bitterly with his grandson, and their rival factions fought for the throne, Michael having died before either of them.
The quarrel of the two Andronici was protracted and suspended and renewed during a ruinous period of 7 years. In the first treaty, the relics of the Greek Empire were divided. Constantinople, Thessalonica, and the islands were left to the elder, while the younger acquired the sovereignty of the greatest part of Thrace, from Philippi to the Byzantine limit. By the second treaty, he stipulated the payment of his troops, his immediate coronation, and an adequate share of the power and revenue of the state. The third civil war was terminated by the surprise of Constantinople, the final retreat of the old emperor, and the sole reign of his victorious grandson. The reasons of this delay may be found in the characters of the men and of the times. When the heir of the monarchy first pleaded his wrongs and his apprehensions, he was heard with pity and applause, and his adherents repeated on all sides the inconsistent promise that he would increase the pay of the soldiers and alleviate the burdens of the people. The grievances of 40 years were mingled in his revolt, and the rising generation was fatigued by the endless prospect of a reign whose favourites and maxims were of other times. The youth of Andronicus had been without spirit. His age was without reverence. His taxes produced an annual revenue of £500,000, yet the richest of the sovereigns of Christendom was incapable of maintaining 3,000 horse and 20 galleys to resist the destructive progress of the Turks. "How different," said the younger Andronicus, "is my situation from that of the son of Philip. Alexander might complain that his father would leave him nothing to conquer. Alas, my grandsire will leave me nothing to lose." But the Greeks were soon admonished that the public disorders could not be healed by a civil war, and that their young favourite was not destined to be the saviour of a falling empire. On the first repulse, his party was broken by his own levity, their intestine discord, and the intrigues of the ancient court, which tempted each malcontent to desert or betray the cause of rebellion. Andronicus the younger was touched with remorse, or fatigued with business, or deceived by negotiation. Pleasure rather than power was his aim, and the license of maintaining 1,000 hounds, 1,000 hawks, and 1,000 huntsmen was sufficient to sully his fame and disarm his ambition. Let us now survey the catastrophe of this busy plot and the final situation of the principal actors. The age of Andronicus was consumed in civil discord, and amidst the events of war and treaty, his power and reputation continually decayed, till the fatal night in which the gates of the city and palace were opened without resistance to his grandson. His principal commander scorned the repeated warnings of danger, and retiring to rest in the vain security of ignorance, abandoned the feeble monarch, with some priests and pages, to the terrors of a sleepless night. These terrors were quickly realized by the hostile shouts which proclaimed the titles and victory of Andronicus the younger, and the aged emperor, falling prostrate before an image of the Virgin, dispatched a suppliant message to resign the sceptre and to obtain his life at the hands of the conqueror. The answer of his grandson was decent and pious. At the prayer of his friends, the younger Andronicus assumed the sole administration. But the elder still enjoyed the name and preeminence of the first emperor, the use of the great palace, and a pension of 24,000 pieces of gold, one half of which was assigned on the royal treasure, and the other on the fishery of Constantinople. But his impotence was soon exposed to contempt and oblivion. The vast silence of the palace was disturbed only by the cattle and poultry of the neighbourhood, which roved with impunity through the solitary courts. And a reduced allowance of 10,000 pieces of gold was all that he could ask, and more than he could hope. His calamities were embittered by the gradual extinction of sight. His confinement was rendered each day more rigorous, and during the absence and sickness of his grandson, his inhuman keepers, by the threats of instant death, compelled him to exchange the purple for the monastic habit and profession. The monk Antony had renounced the pomp of the world, yet he had occasion for a coarse fare in the winter season, and as wine was forbidden by his confessor and water by his physician, the sherbet of Egypt was his common drink. It was not without difficulty that the late emperor could procure 3 or 4 pieces to satisfy these simple wants, and if he bestowed the gold to relieve the more painful distress of a friend, the sacrifice is of some weight in the scale of humanity and religion. 4 years after his abdication, Andronicus, or Antony, expired in a cell in the 74th year of his age, and the last strain of adulation could only promise a more splendid crown of glory in heaven than he had enjoyed upon earth. From the petty quarrels of a city and her suburbs, from the cowardice and discord of the falling Greeks, I shall now ascend to the victorious Turks, whose domestic slavery was ennobled by martial discipline, religious enthusiasm, and the energy of the national character. The rise and progress of the Ottomans, the present sovereigns of Constantinople, are connected with the most important scenes of modern history, but they are founded on a previous knowledge of the great eruption of the Mongols and Tartars, whose rapid conquests may be compared with the primitive convulsions of nature, which have agitated and altered the surface of the globe. I have long since asserted my claim to introduce the nations, the immediate or remote authors of the fall of the Roman Empire, nor can I refuse myself to those events which, from their uncommon magnitude, will interest a philosophic mind in the history of blood. From the spacious highlands between China, Siberia, and the Caspian Sea, the tide of emigration and war has repeatedly been poured. These ancient seats of the Huns and Turks were occupied in the 12th century by many pastoral tribes of the same descent and similar manners, which were united and led to conquest by the formidable Genghis. In his ascent to greatness, that barbarian, whose private appellation was Temujin, had trampled on the necks of his equals. His birth was noble, but it was in the pride of victory that the prince or people deduced his 7th ancestor from the immaculate conception of a virgin. His father had reigned over 13 hordes, which composed about 30 or 40,000 families. Above 2/3 refused to pay tithes or obedience to his infant son, and at the age of 13, Temujin fought a battle against his rebellious subjects. The future conqueror of Asia was reduced to fly and to obey. But he rose superior to his fortune, and in his 40th year he had established his fame and dominion over the circumjacent tribes. In a state of society in which policy is rude and valor is universal, the ascendant of one man must be founded on his power and resolution to punish his enemies and recompense his friends. His first military league was ratified by the simple rites of sacrificing a horse and tasting of a running stream. Temujin pledged himself to divide with his followers the sweets and the bitters of life, and when he had shared among them his horses and apparel, he was rich in their gratitude and his own hopes. After his first victory, he placed 70 cauldrons on the fire, and 70 of the most guilty rebels were cast headlong into the boiling water. The sphere of his attraction was continually enlarged by the ruin of the proud and the submission of the prudent, and the boldest chieftains might tremble when they beheld, enchased in silver, the skull of the Khan of the Keraites, who, under the name of Prester John, had corresponded with the Roman pontiff and the princes of Europe. The ambition of Temujin condescended to employ the arts of superstition, and it was from a naked prophet who could ascend to heaven on a white horse that he accepted the title of Genghis, the Most Great, and a divine right to the conquest and dominion of the earth. In a general kurultai, or diet, he was seated on a felt, which was long afterwards revered as a relic, and solemnly proclaimed Great Khan or Emperor of the Mongols and Tartars. Of these kindred though rival names, the former had given birth to the imperial race, and the latter has been extended by accident or error over the spacious wilderness of the north. The code of laws which Genghis dictated to his subjects was adapted to the preservation of domestic peace and the exercise of foreign hostility. The punishment of death was inflicted on the crimes of adultery, murder, perjury, and the capital thefts of a horse or ox. And the fiercest of men were mild and just in their intercourse with each other. The future election of the Great Khan was vested in the princes of his family and the heads of the tribes, and the regulations of the chase were essential to the pleasures and plenty of a Tartar camp. The victorious nation was held sacred from all servile labours, which were abandoned to slaves and strangers, and every labour was servile, except the profession of arms. The service and discipline of the troops, who were armed with bows, scimitars, and iron maces, and divided by hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s, were the institutions of a veteran commander. Each officer and soldier was made responsible, under pain of death, for the safety and honour of his companions, and the spirit of conquest breathed in the law that peace should never be granted unless to a vanquished and suppliant enemy. But it is the religion of Genghis that best deserves our wonder and applause. The Catholic inquisitors of Europe, who defended nonsense by cruelty, might have been confounded by the example of a barbarian who anticipated the lessons of philosophy and established by his laws a system of pure theism and perfect toleration. His first and only article of faith was the existence of one God, the author of all good, who fills by his presence the heavens and earth, which he has created by his power. The Tartars and Mongols were addicted to the idols of their peculiar tribes, and many of them had been converted by the foreign missionaries to the religions of Moses, of Mohammed, and of Christ. These various systems in freedom and concord were taught and practiced within the precincts of the same camp, and the bonza, the imam, the rabbi, the Nestorian, and the Latin priest enjoyed the same honourable exemption from service and tribute. In the mosque of Bokhara, the insolent victor might trample the Koran under his horse's feet, but the calm legislator respected the prophets and pontiffs of the most hostile sects. The reason of Genghis was not informed by books. The Khan could neither read nor write, and except the tribe of the Uyghurs, the greatest part of the Mongols and Tartars were as illiterate as their sovereign. The memory of their exploits was preserved by tradition. The arms of Genghis and his lieutenants successively reduced the hordes of the desert, who pitched their tents between the wall of China and the Volga. And the Mongol emperor became the monarch of the pastoral world, the lord of many millions of shepherds and soldiers, who felt their united strength and were impatient to rush on the mild and wealthy climates of the south. His ancestors had been the tributaries of the Chinese emperors, and Temujin himself had been disgraced by a title of honour and servitude. The court of Peking was astonished by an embassy from its former vassal, who, in the tone of the King of Nations, exacted the tribute and obedience which he had paid, and who affected to treat the Son of Heaven as the most contemptible of mankind. A haughty answer disguised their secret apprehensions, and their fears were soon justified by the march of innumerable squadrons, who pierced on all sides the feeble rampart of the Great Wall. 90 cities were stormed or starved by the Mongols. 10 only escaped, and Genghis, from a knowledge of the filial piety of the Chinese, covered his vanguard with their captive parents, an unworthy and by degrees a fruitless abuse of the virtue of his enemies. His invasion was supported by the revolt of 100,000 Khitans, who guarded the frontier. Yet he listened to a treaty, and a princess of China, 3,000 horses, 500 youths, and as many virgins, and a tribute of gold and silk were the price of his retreat. In his second expedition, he compelled the Chinese emperor to retire beyond the Yellow River to a more southern residence. The siege of Peking was long and laborious. The inhabitants were reduced by famine to decimate and devour their fellow citizens. When their ammunition was spent, they discharged ingots of gold and silver from their engines. But the Mongols introduced a mine to the center of the capital, and the conflagration of the palace burnt above 30 days. China was desolated by Tartar war and domestic faction, and the 5 northern provinces were added to the empire of Genghis. In the west, he touched the dominions of Muhammad, Sultan of Kharizme, who reigned from the Persian Gulf to the borders of India and Turkestan, and who, in the proud imitation of Alexander the Great, forgot the servitude and ingratitude of his fathers to the house of Seljuk. It was the wish of Genghis to establish a friendly and commercial intercourse with the most powerful of the Muslim princes. Nor could he be tempted by the secret solicitations of the Caliph of Baghdad, who sacrificed to his personal wrongs the safety of the church and state. A rash and inhuman deed provoked and justified the Tartar arms in the invasion of the southern Asia. A caravan of 3 ambassadors and 150 merchants was arrested and murdered at Otrar by the command of Muhammad. Nor was it till after a demand and denial of justice, till he had prayed and fasted 3 nights on a mountain, that the Mongol emperor appealed to the judgment of God and his sword. Our European battles, says a philosophic writer, are petty skirmishes if compared to the numbers that have fought and fallen in the fields of Asia. 700,000 Mongols and Tartars are said to have marched under the standard of Genghis and his 4 sons. In the vast plains that extend to the north of the Sihon or Jaxartes, they were encountered by 400,000 soldiers of the Sultan. And in the first battle, which was suspended by the night, 160,000 Kharizmians were slain. Mohammed was astonished by the multitude and valor of his enemies. He withdrew from the scene of danger and distributed his troops in the frontier towns, trusting that the barbarians, invincible in the field, would be repulsed by the length and difficulty of so many regular sieges. But the prudence of Genghis had formed a body of Chinese engineers, skilled in the mechanic arts, informed, perhaps, of the secret of gunpowder, and capable, under his discipline, of attacking a foreign country with more vigor and success than they had defended their own. The Persian historians will relate the sieges and reduction of Otrar, Kogende, Bokhara, Samarkand, Kharizme, Herat, Meru, Nizapur, Balch, and Kandahar, and the conquest of the rich and populous countries of Transoxiana, Kharizme, and Chorazan. The destructive hostilities of Attila and the Huns have long since been elucidated by the example of Genghis and the Mongols. And in this more proper place I shall be content to observe that from the Caspian to the Indus they ruined a tract of many 100 miles, which was adorned with the habitations and labours of mankind, and that 5 centuries have not been sufficient to repair the ravages of 4 years. The Mongol emperor encouraged or indulged the fury of his troops. The hope of future possession was lost in the ardour of rapine and slaughter, and the cause of the war exasperated their native fierceness by the pretence of justice and revenge. The downfall and death of the Sultan Mohammed, who expired, unpitied and alone, in a desert island of the Caspian Sea, is a poor atonement for the calamities of which he was the author. The harem of Genghis was composed of 500 wives and concubines, and of his numerous progeny, 4 sons, illustrious by their birth and merit, exercised under their father the principal offices of peace and war. Tushi was his great huntsman, Zagatai his judge, Oktai his minister, and Tuli his general. And their names and actions are often conspicuous in the history of his conquests. Firmly united for their own and the public interest, the 3 brothers and their families were content with dependent sceptres, and Oktai, by general consent, was proclaimed Great Khan or Emperor of the Mongols and Tartars. He was succeeded by his son Gayuk, after whose death the empire devolved to his cousins Bangu and Kublai, the sons of Tuli and the grandsons of Genghis. In the 68 years of his 4 first successors, the Mongols subdued almost all Asia and a large portion of Europe.
At this point, Gibbon returns to the fortunes of Constantinople, which by the middle of the 14th century began to be subjected to the attentions of the descendants of Genghis Khan. The emperor of the day, John Cantacuzene, entered into a treaty with the Turkish Ottoman powers, opening the way for the much reduced empire, which, says Gibbon, by the end of this century was contracted to a corner of Thrace between the Propontis and the Black Sea, about 50 miles in length and 30 in breadth, finally to be subsumed within the Ottoman Empire. But not before Timur marched across the stage, delaying the ultimate fall of Constantinople by some 50 years.
The conquest and monarchy of the world was the first object of the ambition of Timur. To live in the memory and esteem of future ages was the second wish of his magnanimous spirit. All the civil and military transactions of his reign were diligently recorded in the journals of his secretaries. The authentic narrative was revised by the persons best informed of each particular transaction, and it is believed in the empire and family of Timur that the monarch himself composed the commentaries of his life and the institutions of his government. But these cares were ineffectual for the preservation of his fame, and these precious memorials in the Mongol or Persian language were concealed from the world, or at least from the knowledge of Europe. The nations which he vanquished exercised a base and impotent revenge, and ignorance has long repeated the tale of calumny which had disfigured the birth and character, the person and even the name of Tamerlane. Yet his real merit would be enhanced rather than debased by the elevation of a peasant to the throne of Asia. Nor can his lameness be a theme of reproach, unless he had the weakness to blush at a natural or perhaps an honourable infirmity. In the eyes of the Mongols, who held the indefeasible succession of the house of Genghis, he was doubtless a rebel subject. Yet he sprang from the noble tribe of Berlas. His 5th ancestor, Karashar Nevian, had been the vizier of Zagatai in his new realm of Transoxiana, and in the ascent of some generations, the branch of Timur is confounded, at least by the females, with the imperial stem. He was born 40 miles to the south of Samarkand, in the village of Sebzar, in the fruitful territory of Kash, of which his fathers were the hereditary chiefs, as well as of a Toman of 10,000 horse. His birth was cast on one of those periods of anarchy which announce the fall of the Asiatic dynasties and open a new field to adventurous ambition. The Khans of Zagatai were extinct. The emirs aspired to independence, and their domestic feuds could only be suspended by the conquest and tyranny of the Khans of Kashgar, who, with an army of Getes or Kalmucks, invaded the Transoxian kingdom. From the 12th year of his age, Timur had entered the field of action. In the 25th, he stood forth as the deliverer of his country, and the eyes and wishes of the people were turned towards a hero who suffered in their cause. The chiefs of the law and of the army had pledged their salvation to support him with their lives and fortunes, but in the hour of danger they were silent and afraid. And after waiting 7 days on the hills of Samarkand, he retreated to the desert with only 60 horsemen. The fugitives were overtaken by 1,000 Getes, whom he repulsed with incredible slaughter, and his enemies were forced to exclaim, "Timur is a wonderful man. Fortune and the divine favour are with him." But in this bloody action his own followers were reduced to 10, a number which was soon diminished by the desertion of 3 Kharizmians. He wandered in the desert with his wife, 7 companions and 4 horses, and 62 days was he plunged in a loathsome dungeon, from whence he escaped by his own courage and the remorse of the oppressor. After swimming the broad and rapid stream of the Jehoon or Oxus, he led during some months the life of a vagrant and outlaw on the borders of the adjacent states. But his fame shone brighter in adversity. He learned to distinguish the friends of his person, the associates of his fortune, and to apply the various characters of men for their advantage and, above all, for his own. On his return to his native country, Timur was successively joined by the parties of his confederates, who anxiously sought him in the desert. Nor can I refuse to describe, in his pathetic simplicity, one of their fortunate encounters. He presented himself as a guide to 3 chiefs, who were at the head of 70 horse. "When their eyes fell upon me," says Timur, "they were overwhelmed with joy, and they alighted from their horses, and they came and kneeled, and they kissed my stirrup. I also came down from my horse, and took each of them in my arms. And I put my turban on the head of the first chief, and my girdle, rich in jewels and wrought with gold, I bound on the loins of the second, and the third I clothed in my own coat. And they wept, and I wept also. And the hour of prayer was arrived, and we prayed. And we mounted our horses, and came to my dwelling. And I collected my people, and made a feast." His trusty bands were soon increased by the bravest of the tribes. He led them against a superior foe, and after some vicissitudes of war, the Getes were finally driven from the kingdom of Transoxiana. He had done much for his own glory, but much remained to be done, much art to be exerted, and some blood to be spilt, before he could teach his equals to obey him as their master. The birth and power of Emir Hussein compelled him to accept a vicious and unworthy colleague, whose sister was the best beloved of his wives. Their union was short and jealous. But the policy of Timur, in their frequent quarrels, exposed his rival to the reproach of injustice and perfidy, and, after a final defeat, Hussein was slain by some sagacious friends who presumed, for the last time, to disobey the commands of their lord. At the age of 34, and in a general diet or kurultai, he was invested with imperial command. But he affected to revere the house of Genghis, and while the Emir Timur reigned over Zagatai and the east, a nominal Khan served as a private officer in the armies of his servant. A fertile kingdom, 500 miles in length and in breadth, might have satisfied the ambition of a subject. But Timur aspired to the dominion of the world, and before his death the crown of Zagatai was one of the 27 crowns which he had placed on his head.
Gibbon relates the 35 military campaigns of Timur in Persia, Tartary, and India before proceeding to his Ottoman wars. In 1400 AD, he reportedly faced the Turkish Sultan Bajazet, then engaged in one of the many regular blockades of Constantinople. Timur marched against Bajazet's prized city of Aleppo in Syria.
The Syrian emirs were assembled at Aleppo to repel the invasion. They confided in the fame and discipline of the Mamelukes, in the temper of their swords and lances of the purest steel of Damascus, in the strength of their walled cities, and in the populousness of 60,000 villages. And instead of sustaining a siege, they threw open their gates and arrayed their forces in the plain. But these forces were not cemented by virtue and union, and some powerful emirs had been seduced to desert or betray their more loyal companions. Timur's front was covered with a line of Indian elephants, whose turrets were filled with archers and Greek fire. The rapid evolutions of his cavalry completed the dismay and disorder. The Syrian crowds fell back on each other. Many thousands were stifled or slaughtered in the entrance of the great street. The Mongols entered with the fugitives, and after a short defense, the citadel, the impregnable citadel of Aleppo, was surrendered by cowardice or treachery. Among the suppliants and captives, Timur distinguished the doctors of the law, whom he invited to the dangerous honor of a personal conference. The Mongol prince was a zealous Mussulman, but his Persian schools had taught him to revere the memory of Ali and Hussein, and he had imbibed a deep prejudice against the Syrians as the enemies of the son of the daughter of the Apostle of God. To these doctors he proposed a captious question, which the casuists of Bokhara, Samarkand, and Herat were incapable of resolving. Who are the true martyrs, of those who are slain on my side or on that of mine enemies? But he was silenced or satisfied by the dexterity of one of the Qadis of Aleppo, who replied, in the words of Muhammad himself, that the motive, not the ensign, constitutes the martyr, and that the Muslims of either party, who fight only for the glory of God, may deserve that sacred appellation. The true succession of the caliphs was a controversy of a still more delicate nature, and the frankness of a doctor, too honest for his situation, provoked the emperor to exclaim, "Ye are as false as those of Damascus. Muawiyah was a usurper, Yazid a tyrant, and Ali alone is the lawful successor of the Prophet." A prudent explanation restored his tranquillity, and he passed to a more familiar topic of conversation. "What is your age?" said he to the Cadi. 50 years. "It would be the age of my eldest son. You see me here," continued Timur, "a poor, lame, decrepit mortal. Yet by my arm has the Almighty been pleased to subdue the kingdoms of Iran, Turan, and the Indies. I am not a man of blood, and God is my witness that in all my wars I have never been the aggressor, and that my enemies have always been the authors of their own calamity." During this peaceful conversation, the streets of Aleppo streamed with blood and re-echoed with the cries of mothers and children, with the shrieks of violated virgins. The rich plunder that was abandoned to his soldiers might stimulate their avarice, but their cruelty was enforced by the peremptory command of producing an adequate number of heads, which, according to his custom, were curiously piled in columns and pyramids. The Mongols celebrated the Feast of Victory, while the surviving Muslims passed the night in tears and in chains. I shall not dwell on the march of the destroyer from Aleppo to Damascus, where he was rudely encountered and almost overthrown by the armies of Egypt. A retrograde motion was imputed to his distress and despair. One of his nephews deserted to the enemy, and Syria rejoiced in the tale of his defeat when the Sultan was driven by the revolt of the Mamelukes to escape with precipitation and shame to his palace of Cairo. Abandoned by their prince, the inhabitants of Damascus still defended their walls, and Timur consented to raise the siege if they would adorn his retreat with a gift or ransom, each article of 9 pieces. But no sooner had he introduced himself into the city, under colour of a truce, than he perfidiously violated the treaty, imposed a contribution of 10 millions of gold, and animated his troops to chastise the posterity of those Syrians who had executed or approved the murder of the grandson of Mohammed. A family which had given honourable burial to the head of Hussein, and a colony of artificers whom he sent to labour at Samarkand, were alone reserved in the general massacre. And after a period of 7 centuries, Damascus was reduced to ashes, because a Tartar was moved by religious zeal to avenge the blood of an Arab. The losses and fatigues of the campaign obliged Timur to renounce the conquest of Palestine and Egypt. But in his return to the Euphrates, he delivered Aleppo to the flames, and justified his pious motive by the pardon and reward of 2,000 sectaries of Ali, who were desirous to visit the tomb of his son. I have expatiated on the personal anecdotes which mark the character of the Mongol hero, but I shall briefly mention that he erected on the ruins of Baghdad a pyramid of 90,000 heads, again visited Georgia, encamped on the banks of the Araxes, and proclaimed his resolution of marching against the Ottoman Emperor. Conscious of the importance of the war, he collected his forces from every province. 800,000 men were enrolled on his military list. But the splendid commands of 5,000 and 10,000 horse may be rather expressive of the rank and pension of the chiefs than of the genuine number of effective soldiers. In the pillage of Syria, the Mongols had acquired immense riches, but the delivery of their pay and arrears for 7 years more firmly attached them to the imperial standard. During this diversion of the Mongol arms, Bajazet had 2 years to collect his forces for a more serious encounter. They consisted of 400,000 horse and foot, whose merit and fidelity were of an unequal complexion. We may discriminate the Janissaries, who have been gradually raised to an establishment of 40,000 men, and national cavalry, the Spahis of modern times, 20,000 cuirassiers of Europe, clad in black and impenetrable armour, the troops of Anatolia, whose princes had taken a refuge in the camp of Timur, and a colony of Tartars whom he had driven from Kipzak, and to whom Bajazet had assigned a settlement in the plains of Adrianople. The fearless confidence of the Sultan urged him to meet his antagonist, and as if he had chosen that spot for revenge, he displayed his banners near the ruins of the unfortunate Suvas. In the meanwhile, Timur moved from the Araxes through the countries of Armenia and Anatolia. His boldness was secured by the wisest precautions. His speed was guided by order and discipline, and the woods, the mountains and the rivers were diligently explored by the flying squadrons who marked his road and preceded his standard. Firm in his plan of fighting in the heart of the Ottoman kingdom, he avoided their camp, dexterously inclined to the left, occupied Caesarea, traversed the salt desert and the river Halys, and invested Angora, while the Sultan, immovable and ignorant in his post, compared the Tartar swiftness to the crawling of a snail. He returned on the wings of indignation to the relief of Angora, and as both generals were alike impatient for action, the plains round that city were the scene of a memorable battle which has immortalized the glory of Timur and the shame of Bajazet. For this signal victory, the Mongol emperor was indebted to himself, to the genius of the moment, and the discipline of 30 years. He had improved the tactics without violating the manners of his nation, whose force still consisted in the missile weapons and rapid evolutions of a numerous cavalry. From a single troop to a great army, the mode of attack was the same. Our foremost line first advanced to the charge and was supported in a just order by the squadrons of the great vanguard. The general's eye watched over the field, and at his command the front and rear of the right and left wings successively moved forwards in their several divisions and in a direct or oblique line. The enemy was pressed by 18 or 20 attacks, and each attack afforded a chance of victory. If they all proved fruitless or unsuccessful, the occasion was worthy of the emperor himself, who gave the signal of advancing to the standard and main body, which he led in person. But in the Battle of Angora, the main body itself was supported on the flanks and in the rear by the bravest squadrons of the reserve, commanded by the sons and grandsons of Timur. The conqueror of Hindustan ostentatiously showed a line of elephants, the trophies, rather than the instruments of victory. The use of the Greek fire was familiar to the Mongols and Ottomans. But had they borrowed from Europe the recent invention of gunpowder and cannon, the artificial thunder in the hands of either nation must have turned the fortune of the day. In that day, Bajazet displayed the qualities of a soldier and a chief. But his genius sunk under a stronger ascendant, and from various motives, the greatest part of his troops failed him in the decisive moment. His rigour and avarice had provoked a mutiny among the Turks, and even his son Soliman too hastily withdrew from the field. The forces of Anatolia, loyal in their revolt, were drawn away to the banners of their lawful princes. His Tartar allies had been tempted by the letters and emissaries of Timur, who reproached their ignoble servitude under the slaves of their fathers, and offered to their hopes the dominion of their new or the liberty of their ancient country. In the right wing of Bajazet, the cuirassiers of Europe charged with faithful hearts and irresistible arms. But these men of iron were soon broken by an artful flight and headlong pursuit, and the Janissaries, alone, without cavalry or missile weapons, were encompassed by the circle of the Mongol hunters. Their valour was at length oppressed by heat, thirst, and the weight of numbers. And the unfortunate Sultan, afflicted with the gout in his hands and feet, was transported from the field on the fleetest of his horses. He was pursued and taken by the titular Khan of Zagatai, and after his capture and the defeat of the Ottoman powers, the kingdom of Anatolia submitted to the conqueror, who planted his standard at Kyotohia and dispersed on all sides the ministers of rapine and destruction.
Timur died in 1405 AD, aged 70, on campaign in China. By 1422, Constantinople was once more under siege by Turkish armies.
The only hope of salvation for the Greek Empire and the adjacent kingdoms would have been some more powerful weapon, some discovery in the art of war that should give them a decisive superiority over their Turkish foes. Such a weapon was in their hands. Such a discovery had been made in the critical moment of their fate. The chemists of China or Europe had found, by casual or elaborate experiments, that a mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal produces, with a spark of fire, a tremendous explosion. It was soon observed that, if the expansive force were compressed in a strong tube, a ball of stone or iron might be expelled with irresistible and destructive velocity. The precise era of the invention and application of gunpowder is involved in doubtful traditions and equivocal language. Yet we may clearly discern that it was known before the middle of the 14th century, and that before the end of the same, the use of artillery in battles and sieges by sea and land was familiar to the states of Germany, Italy, Spain, France, and England. The priority of nations is of small account. None could derive any exclusive benefit from their previous or superior knowledge. And in the common improvement they stood on the same level of relative power and military science. Nor was it possible to circumscribe the secret within the pale of the Church. It was disclosed to the Turks by the treachery of apostates and the selfish policy of rivals. And the sultans had sense to adopt and wealth to reward the talents of a Christian engineer. The Genoese who transported Amurath into Europe must be accused as his preceptors, and it was probably by their hands that his cannon was cast and directed at the siege of Constantinople. The first attempt was indeed unsuccessful, but in the general warfare of the age, the advantage was on their side, who were most commonly the assailants. For a while the proportion of the attack and defence was suspended, and this thundering artillery was pointed against the walls and towers which had been erected only to resist the less potent engines of antiquity. By the Venetians the use of gunpowder was communicated without reproach to the sultans of Egypt and Persia, their allies against the Ottoman power. The secret was soon propagated to the extremities of Asia, and the advantages of the European was confined to his easy victories over the savages of the New World. If we contrast the rapid progress of this mischievous discovery with the slow and laborious advances of reason, science, and the arts of peace, a philosopher, according to his temper, will laugh or weep at the folly of mankind.
Mohammed II, whom Gibbon calls the Great Destroyer, now enters this, the final act of the Byzantine Empire. Gibbon tells us that Mohammed II reportedly spoke 5 languages: Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, Persian, and Latin. But as Gibbon adds, the influence of religion and learning were employed without effect on his savage and licentious nature. I will not transcribe, nor do I firmly believe, the stories of his 14 pages whose bellies were ripped open in search of a stolen melon, or of the beauteous slave whose head he severed from her body to convince the Janissaries that their master was not the votary of love. But it cannot be denied that his passions were at once furious and inexorable. Mohammed II was absolutely determined to capture the prize of Constantinople. In 1453, he started a siege of the city, then under the final emperor, Constantine.
Among the implements of destruction, he studied with peculiar care the recent and tremendous discovery of the Latins. and his artillery surpassed whatever had yet appeared in the world. A founder of cannon, a Dane or Hungarian, who had been almost starved in the Greek service, deserted to the Muslims and was liberally entertained by the Turkish Sultan. Mohammed was satisfied with the answer to his first question, which he eagerly pressed on the artist. "Am I able to cast a cannon, capable of throwing a ball or stone of sufficient size to batter the walls of Constantinople? I am not ignorant of their strength, but were they more solid than those of Babylon, I could oppose an engine of superior power. The position and management of that engine must be left to your engineers." On this assurance, a foundry was established at Adrianople. The metal was prepared, and at the end of 3 months, Urban produced a piece of brass ordnance of stupendous and almost incredible magnitude. A measure of 12 palms is assigned to the bore, and the stone bullet weighed above 600 pounds. A vacant place before the new palace was chosen for the first experiment. But to prevent the sudden and mischievous effects of astonishment and fear, a proclamation was issued that the cannon would be discharged the ensuing day. The explosion was felt or heard in a circuit of 100 furlongs. The ball, by the force of gunpowder, was driven above a mile, and on the spot where it fell, it buried itself a fathom deep in the ground. For the conveyance of this destructive engine, a frame or carriage of 30 wagons was linked together and drawn along by a team of 60 oxen. 200 men on both sides were stationed to poise and support the rolling weight. 250 workmen marched before to smooth the way and repair the bridges. And near 2 months were employed in a laborious journey of 150 miles. A lively philosopher derides on this occasion the credulity of the Greeks, and observes, with much reason, that we should always distrust the exaggeration of a vanquished people. He calculates that a ball, even of 200 pounds, would require a charge of 150 pounds of powder, and that the stroke would be feeble and impotent, since not a 15th part of the mass could be inflamed at the same moment. A stranger as I am to the art of destruction, I can discern that the modern improvements of artillery prefer the number of pieces to the weight of metal, the quickness of the fire to the sound, or even the consequences of a single explosion. And yet I dare not reject the positive and unanimous evidence of contemporary writers. Nor can it seem improbable that the first artists, in their rude and ambitious efforts, should have transgressed the standard of moderation. A Turkish cannon, more enormous than that of Mohammed, still guards the entrance of the Dardanelles, and if the use be inconvenient, it has been found on a late trial that the effect was far from contemptible. A stone bullet of 1,100 pounds weight was once discharged with 330 pounds of powder. At the distance of 600 yards, it shivered into 3 rocky fragments, traversed the strait, and leaving the waters in a foam, again rose and bounded against the opposite hill. While Mohammed threatened the capital of the East, the Greek emperor implored with fervent prayers the assistance of earth and heaven. But the invisible powers were deaf to his supplications, and Christendom beheld with indifference the fall of Constantinople, while she derived at least some promise of supply from the jealous and temporal policy of the Sultan of Egypt. Some states were too weak, and others too remote. By some the danger was considered as imaginary, by others as inevitable. The Western princes were involved in their endless and domestic quarrels, and the Roman pontiff was exasperated by the falsehood or obstinacy of the Greeks. Instead of employing in their favour the arms and treasures of Italy, Nicholas V had foretold their approaching ruin, and his honour was engaged in the accomplishment of his prophecy. Perhaps he was softened by the last extremity of their distress, but his compassion was tardy. His efforts were faint and unavailing, and Constantinople had fallen before the squadrons of Genoa and Venice could sail from their harbours. Even the princes of the Morea and of the Greek islands affected a cold neutrality. The Genoese colony of Galata negotiated a private treaty, and the Sultan indulged them in the delusive hope that by his clemency they might survive the ruin of the empire. A plebeian crowd and some Byzantine nobles basely withdrew from the danger of their country, and the avarice of the rich denied the emperor and reserved for the Turks the secret treasures which might have raised in their defence whole armies of mercenaries. The indigent and solitary prince prepared, however, to sustain his formidable adversary. But if his courage were equal to the peril, his strength was inadequate to the contest. In the beginning of the spring, the Turkish vanguard swept the towns and villages as far as the gates of Constantinople. Submission was spared and protected. Whatever presumed to resist was exterminated with fire and sword. The Greek places on the Black Sea, Mesembria, Achelleum and Bison, surrendered on the first summons. Selymbria alone deserved the honours of a siege and blockade, and the bold inhabitants, while they were invested by land, launched their boats, pillaged the opposite coast of Cyzicus, and sold their captives in the public market. But on the approach of Mohammed himself, all was silent and prostrate. He first halted at a distance of 5 miles, and from thence, advancing in battle array, planted before the gate of St. Romanus the imperial standard, and on the 6th day of April formed the memorable siege of Constantinople. In her last decay, Constantinople was still peopled with more than 100,000 inhabitants. But these numbers are found in the accounts not of war but of captivity, and they mostly consisted of mechanics, of priests, of women, and of men devoid of that spirit which even women have sometimes exerted for the common safety. I could almost excuse the reluctance of subjects to serve on a distant frontier at the will of a tyrant. But the man who dares not expose his life in the defence of his children and his property has lost in society the first and most active energies of nature. By the emperor's command, a particular inquiry had been made through the streets and houses how many of the citizens, or even of the monks, were able and willing to bear arms for their country. The lists were entrusted to Franza, and after a diligent addition, he informed his master with grief and surprise that the national defence was reduced to 4,970 Romans. Between Constantine and his faithful minister, this comfortless secret was preserved, and a sufficient proportion of shields, crossbows, and muskets was distributed from the arsenal to the city bands. They derived some accession from a body of 2,000 strangers, under the command of John Justiniani, a noble Genoese. A liberal donative was advanced to these auxiliaries, and a princely recompense, the Isle of Lemnos, was promised to the valour and victory of their chief. A strong chain was drawn across the mouth of the harbour. It was supported by some Greek and Italian vessels of war and merchandise, and the ships of every Christian nation that successively arrived from Candia and the Black Sea were detained for the public service. Against the powers of the Ottoman Empire, a city of the extent of 13, perhaps of 16 miles, was defended by a scanty garrison of 7,000 or 8,000 soldiers. Europe and Asia were open to the besiegers, but the strength and provisions of the Greeks must sustain a daily decrease, nor could they indulge the expectation of any foreign succour or supply. The primitive Romans would have drawn their swords in the resolution of death or conquest. The primitive Christians might have embraced each other and awaited in patience and charity the stroke of martyrdom. But the Greeks of Constantinople were animated only by the spirit of religion, and that spirit was productive only of animosity and discord. Before his death, the Emperor John Palaeologus had renounced the unpopular measure of a union with the Latins. Nor was the idea revived till the distress of his brother Constantine imposed a last trial of flattery and dissimulation. With a demand of temporal aid, his ambassadors were instructed to mingle the assurance of spiritual obedience. His neglect of the Church was excused by the urgent cares of the state, and his orthodox wishes solicited the presence of a Roman legate. The Vatican had been too often deluded, yet the signs of repentance could not decently be overlooked. A legate was more easily granted than an army. and about 6 months before the final destruction, the Cardinal Isidore of Russia appeared in that character with a retinue of priests and soldiers. The emperor saluted him as a friend and father, respectfully listened to his public and private sermons, and, with the most obsequious of the clergy and laymen, subscribed the Act of Union, as it had been ratified in the Council of Florence. On the 12th of December, the two nations in the Church of St. Sophia joined in the communion of sacrifice and prayer, and the names of the two pontiffs were solemnly commemorated. The names of Nicholas V, the Vicar of Christ, and of the Patriarch Gregory, who had been driven into exile by a rebellious people. Of the triangle which composes the figure of Constantinople, the two sides along the sea were made inaccessible to an enemy, the Propontis by nature and the harbour by art. Between the two waters, the basis of the triangle, the land side, was protected by a double wall and a deep ditch of the depth of 100 feet. Against this line of fortification, which Franza, an eyewitness, prolongs to the measure of 6 miles, the Ottomans directed their principal attack, and the emperor, after distributing the service and command of the most perilous stations, undertook the defence of the external wall. In the first days of the siege, the Greek soldiers descended into the ditch, or sallied into the field. But they soon discovered that, in the proportion of their numbers, 1 Christian was of more value than 20 Turks. And after these bold preludes, they were prudently content to maintain the rampart with their missile weapons. Nor should this prudence be accused of pusillanimity. The nation was indeed pusillanimous and base. But the last Constantine deserves the name of a hero. His noble band of volunteers was inspired with Roman virtue, and the foreign auxiliaries supported the honour of the Western chivalry. The incessant volleys of lances and arrows were accompanied with the smoke, the sound, and the fire of their musketry and cannon. Their small arms discharged at the same time either 5 or even 10 balls of lead of the size of a walnut, and according to the closeness of the ranks and the force of the powder, several breastplates and bodies were transpierced by the same shot. But the Turkish approaches were soon sunk in trenches or covered with ruins. Each day added to the science of the Christians, but their inadequate stock of gunpowder was wasted in the operations of each day. Their ordnance was not powerful either in size or number, and if they possessed some heavy cannon, they feared to plant them on the walls, lest the aged structure should be shaken and overthrown by the explosion. The same destructive secret had been revealed to the Muslims, by whom it was employed with a superior energy of zeal, riches, and despotism. The great cannon of Mohammed has been separately noticed, an important and visible object in the history of the times. But that enormous engine was flanked by 2 fellows almost of equal magnitude. The long order of the Turkish artillery was pointed against the walls. 14 batteries thundered at once on the most accessible places, and of one of these it is ambiguously expressed that it was mounted with 130 guns, or that it discharged 130 bullets. Yet in the power and activity of the Sultan we may discern the infancy of the new science. Under a master who counted the moments, the great cannon could be loaded and fired no more than 7 times in one day. The heated metal unfortunately burst. Several workmen were destroyed, and the skill of an artist was admired who bethought himself of preventing the danger and the accident by pouring oil after each explosion into the mouth of the cannon. The first random shots were productive of more sound than effect, and it was by the advice of a Christian that the engineers were taught to level their aim against the 2 opposite sides of the salient angles of a bastion. However imperfect, the weight and repetition of the fire made some impression on the walls, and the Turks, pushing their approaches to the edge of the ditch, attempted to fill the enormous chasm and to build a road to the assault. Innumerable fascines and hogsheads and trunks of trees were heaped on each other, and such was the impetuosity of the throng that the foremost and the weakest were pushed headlong down the precipice and instantly buried under the accumulated mass. To fill the ditch was the toil of the besiegers. To clear away the rubbish was the safety of the besieged. And after a long and bloody conflict, the web that had been woven in the day was still unravelled in the night. The next resource of Mohammed was the practice of mines. But the soil was rocky. In every attempt he was stopped and undermined by the Christian engineers. Nor had the art been yet invented of replenishing those subterraneous passages with gunpowder and blowing whole towers and cities into the air. A circumstance that distinguishes the siege of Constantinople is the reunion of the ancient and modern artillery. The cannon were intermingled with the mechanical engines for casting stones and darts. The bullet and the battering ram were directed against the same walls. Nor had the discovery of gunpowder superseded the use of the liquid and unextinguishable fire. A wooden turret of the largest size was advanced on rollers. This portable magazine of ammunition and fascines was protected by a threefold covering of bulls' hides. Incessant volleys were securely discharged from the loopholes. In the front, 3 doors were contrived for the alternate sally and retreat of the soldiers and workmen. They ascended by a staircase to the upper platform, and as high as the level of that platform, a scaling ladder could be raised by pulleys to form a bridge and grapple with the adverse rampart. By these various arts of annoyance, some as new as they were pernicious to the Greeks, the tower of St. Romanus was at length overturned. After a severe struggle, the Turks were repulsed from the breach and interrupted by darkness. But they trusted that with the return of light they should renew the attack with fresh vigour and decisive success. Of this pause of action, this interval of hope, each moment was improved by the activity of the Emperor and Justiniani, who passed the night on the spot and urged the labours which involved the safety of the church and city. At the dawn of day, the impatient Sultan perceived, with astonishment and grief, that his wooden turret had been reduced to ashes. The ditch was cleared and restored, and the tower of St. Romanus was again strong and entire. He deplored the failure of his design, and uttered a profane exclamation that the word of the 37,000 prophets should not have compelled him to believe that such a work in so short a time could have been accomplished by the infidels. After a siege of 40 days, the fate of Constantinople could no longer be averted. The diminutive garrison was exhausted by a double attack. The fortifications, which had stood for ages against hostile violence, were dismantled on all sides by the Ottoman cannon. Many breaches were opened, and near the gate of St. Romanus 4 towers had been levelled with the ground. For the payment of his feeble and mutinous troops, Constantine was compelled to despoil the churches with the promise of a 4-fold restitution, and his sacrilege offered a new reproach to the enemies of the Union. During the siege of Constantinople, the words of peace and capitulation had been sometimes pronounced, and several embassies had passed between the camp and the city. The Greek emperor was humbled by adversity, and would have yielded to any terms compatible with religion and royalty. The Turkish Sultan was desirous of sparing the blood of his soldiers, still more desirous of securing for his own use the Byzantine treasures, and he accomplished a sacred duty in presenting to the Gabours the choice of circumcision, of tribute, or of death. The avarice of Mohammed might have been satisfied with an annual sum of 100,000 ducats, but his ambition grasped the capital of the East. To the prince he offered a rich equivalent, to the people a free toleration or a safe departure. But after some fruitless treaty, he declared his resolution of finding either a throne or a grave under the walls of Constantinople. A sense of honour and the fear of universal reproach forbade Palaeologus to resign the city into the hands of the Ottomans, and he determined to abide the last extremities of war. Several days were employed by the Sultan in the preparations of the assault, and a respite was granted by his favourite science of astrology, which had fixed on the 29th of May as the fortunate and fatal hour. On the evening of the 27th, he issued his final orders, assembled in his presence the military chiefs, and dispersed his heralds through the camp to proclaim the duty and the motives of the perilous enterprise. Fear is the first principle of a despotic government, and his menaces were expressed in the Oriental style, that the fugitives and deserters, had they the wings of a bird, should not escape from his inexorable justice. The greatest part of his Bashors and Janissaries were the offspring of Christian parents, but the glories of the Turkish name were perpetuated by successive adoption. And in the gradual change of individuals, the spirit of a legion, a regiment, or an order is kept alive by imitation and discipline. In this holy warfare, the Moslems were exhorted to purify their minds with prayer, their bodies with 7 ablutions, and to abstain from food till the close of the ensuing day. A crowd of dervishes visited the tents to instill the desire of martyrdom and the assurance of spending an immortal youth amidst the rivers and gardens of paradise and in the embraces of the black-eyed virgins. Yet Mohammed principally trusted to the efficacy of temporal and visible rewards. A double pay was promised to the victorious troops. "The city and the buildings," said Mohammed, "are mine, but I resign to your valor the captives and the spoil, the treasures of gold and beauty. Be rich and be happy. Many are the provinces of my empire. The intrepid soldier who first ascends the walls of Constantinople shall be rewarded with the government of the fairest and most wealthy, and my gratitude shall accumulate his honors and fortunes above the measure of his own hopes." Such various and potent motives diffused among the Turks a general ardor, regardless of life and impatient for action. The camp re-echoed with the Moslem shouts of, "God is God! There is but one God, and Mohammed is the apostle of God." And the sea and land, from Galata to the 7 Towers, were illuminated by the blaze of their nocturnal fires. Far different was the state of the Christians, who with loud and impotent complaints deplored the guilt or the punishment of their sins. The celestial image of the Virgin had been exposed in solemn procession, but their divine patroness was deaf to their entreaties. They accused the obstinacy of the emperor for refusing a timely surrender, anticipated the horrors of their fate, and sighed for the repose and security of Turkish servitude. The noblest of the Greeks and the bravest of the allies were summoned to the palace to prepare them on the evening of the 28th for the duties and dangers of the general assault. The last speech of Palaeologus was the funeral oration of the Roman Empire. He promised, he conjured, and he vainly attempted to infuse the hope which was extinguished in his own mind. In this world all was comfortless and gloomy, and neither the gospel nor the church have proposed any conspicuous recompense to the heroes who fall in the service of their country. But the example of their prince and the confinement of a siege had armed these warriors with the courage of despair, and the pathetic scene is described by the feelings of the historian Franza, who was himself present at this mournful assembly. They wept, they embraced. Regardless of their families and fortunes, they devoted their lives, and each commander, departing to his station, maintained all night a vigilant and anxious watch on the rampart. The emperor and some faithful companions entered the dome of St. Sophia, which in a few hours was to be converted into a mosque, and devoutly received with tears and prayers the sacrament of the Holy Communion. He reposed some moments in the palace, which resounded with cries and lamentations, solicited the pardon of all whom he might have injured, and mounted on horseback to visit the guards and explore the motions of the enemy. The distress and fall of the last Constantine are more glorious than the long prosperity of the Byzantine Caesars.